Hi, everyone. We are excited to kick off our second session of our first ever data deliberation series. You have just joined us for a panel exploring data sharing mechanisms for India's migration crisis. My name is Aditi Ramesh. I am a researcher at Aapti and a member of the Data Economy Lab team. For those of you unfamiliar with Aapti, we are a public research firm based in Bangalore, exploring the intersection of tech and society in India. I am joined here today by three wonderful panelists, Gargi, Sharma, Aditi Surie, and Katie Pickett. But before I introduce our panel and speakers, we have a couple of housekeeping rules I just wanted to go over. These will also be posted in the chat later for your reference. If you choose to participate, please do introduce yourself in the chat, your work, your interests. We'd love to hear from you and your work and expertise in this area and what you do. The session will be recorded, and so we will be sharing that link after the session as well. The event is also being live tweeted on Twitter. And so if you would like to follow us, please follow us on at the Institute, and we'll also be using the hashtag #AppTheDataDeliberations Data Deliberations if you'd like to share your thoughts as well. We've reserved some time at the end for questions, so please direct your questions to the Q&A tab on the Zoom link. And as this is our first discussion series, we'll be sharing a short poll after the event and would really appreciate it if you could spend a couple of minutes filling this out at the end to give us feedback. Yeah, those are our housekeeping rules. They will be posted in the chat, as I mentioned. And let us know if you have any other questions. To give you some more context on the work at the Data Economy Lab, we launched DEL with the support of Amidyar Network India, a collaborative problem-solving space to work through issues on data stewardship. We hope to derive solutions to rebalance the data economy. We believe responsible data stewardship can unlock the societal value of data while safeguarding the rights of individuals and communities. And we see data stewards as intermediaries that lie between users, data controllers, and that play a significant role in easing the process of sharing, providing greater control over data, and the decisions around it to users. And so as we dive deeper into data stewardship and explore how we can move from theory to practice, we are beginning to research applications of stewardship. Women's safety, as my colleague Suha just led a panel on about 30 minutes ago, community data, non-personal data, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. And we wanted to organize these deliberations to converse with experts and dive into some of these issues a little bit deeper. So a little bit more about today's panel. In the wake of the COVID-19 lockdown, mainstream data sharing systems have not been responsive to the needs of migrant workers in India, as evidenced in the challenges faced in providing medical care, housing, food, trains, transportation during the lockdown. And this data gap has mostly been filled by ad hoc data collection mechanisms, both by government and civil society. So we are joined today by three fantastic panelists who will weigh in with some of their perspectives on designing data sharing ecosystems for migrant laborers in India, and that enable better service delivery. And today we bring together diverse perspectives who are working on questions around tech, data, labor, rights to understand some of their prominent lessons learned from these experiences. So I'll give a quick bio of each of our panelists, and then you'll hear more from them, of course, throughout the session. Our first panelist, Gargi, is a researcher at Tilburg and co-editor of Global Data Justice, where she's researching the prevalence of data partnerships in the humanitarian sector, addressing questions of regulation, ethics, and accountability. Aditi Surie is a consultant at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, where she investigates the nature and conditions of work in the life of urban residents. She is specifically exploring the impacts of tech and data on gig economy workers. And lastly, Katie Pickett, who joins us from Cadasta Foundation, is exploring how Cadasta themselves can be a steward for land and property rights. And so we'll spend the next 70 to 80 minutes unpacking how data can and should be shared for vulnerable communities, such as migrants, extrapolating learnings from our panelists' diverse perspectives, and kind of bringing into focus why data stewardship can be relevant in the context of this issue. So I'll start off by letting Aditi give us some more context on her work on migration, labor, and data in India, and some of the current gaps in the data sharing ecosystem for migrant laborers.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you to Aapti also for starting this and for having us all on and for having me on. And I think this take on the intersection between the migrant crisis in India and the infrastructure that the digital economy is starting to provide to the countries. We're having this conversation at the right time. So zooming out a bit, I'm a faculty and researcher at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So I have been looking at the development of labor platforms and digital labor markets for the last 5 years now, as the industry has taken scale in India. And in my work, I look at the characteristics of the informal economy, or economic activity that is unorganized, falls under the government radar, or falls out possibly of formal banking systems, or even formal governance systems. So I reflect on how platform operators or technology firms shape their digital product offerings according to this kind of a political economy, and how the Indian socio-economic context affects platform strategies, and ultimately how service providers feel their labor is treated and when they work on platforms. And there are a few things that I would like to focus as I speak today. And firstly, I think the overarching issue for me that's really come out during the COVID crisis has been is to try and find a productive way to understand private capacity of technology companies, state capacity, which has authority but often lacks the skills and knowledge with this kind of economy, and where responsibility falls, either public responsibility or private responsibility. And so for me, this kind of takes the discussion away from, say, models of data governance, but contextualizes these questions for the political economy of a developmental state. And for me, I find the framing of a discussion like this, or a data deliberation, in questions of data justice to be more important than the mere modalities of working through who does what. And so to focus a little bit more on the platform economy, and trying to understand the relationship between the platform economy, the Indian urban labor market, and migration is really challenging to do. At all kind of three factors, and there's simply a lack of data out there that can be easily kind of homogenized and understood to give a kind of coherent picture of what's going on. So key sources of public data have competing definitions, methods, and lately we've seen public data sets being withheld. And so many sources of public data, like say the Niti Aayog or the Employment Provident Fund Organization in India, have been reliant on whatever little data that platforms have been kind of forced to give them to account for even the size of the gig economy and its share in national employment. And so again, labor statistics from platforms rests within the intellectual property of labor platforms, and just simply the number of active service providers on mobility platforms like Uber and Ola has been a contentious number. And this singular number has played a pretty key role in both companies fighting regulatory battles and to try and confuse legal institutions like the Competitions Commission of India. And so, there are very many different reasons for a lack of data, either from public agencies or from or private, players not putting data out with very different political economies, and each is inherently incomparable. And I want to dig down to exactly how this kind of starts to translate into the kind of lived experience of, say, a food delivery worker. Many of the services that digital platforms have, on-demand digital platforms have offered in India, existed within the informal sector. And within the informal economy, within the informal sector, whether that be driving, delivery, or home services. But this kind of overlay of the digital economy with the informal economy, I think embeds and creates a very strong relationship between what the questions of data, governance, justice, migration, and decent work are for me. And many of the ways in which informality presents itself to the technology industry is extremely unique because often these technology platforms are being able to create computational understandings of things that have existed outside the world of law and public data sets. So they're actually getting kind of one step up in creating what a definition of things are going to be. And I'm going to give an example of that. And one of the biggest groups, one of the biggest grouses against the informal economy has been that, earnings have gone unbanked, which have impacted large-scale financial systems. When in India we have over 80% of our workforce in these working conditions. So for technology companies, for example, this has meant that finding financialized versions of trust have been grounds of innovation and not regulation, right? And I think so. As I was talking to a CEO of an on-demand platform about two years ago now, he said one of the biggest issues that his company had to solve for in the first years was to understand how to create a credit score for a worker, right? And this wasn't a credit score to be eligible for a loan from a lender, but rather to exist in a labor market, to exist in their proprietary labor market. And through his discussion, he described how uncomfortable he was hacking into this. Because he felt there was no national, benchmark or methodology or state-sponsored way of backing the decisions up. And his singular ask from the public ecosystem back in 2018 was the state to provide this one score of financial trust that could allow his company to understand how to categorize different kinds of workers, how to be respectful of the different kind of places they came from, because they really had no other data-driven ways of trying to understand that. So the current methodology for creating that kind of a score was a heavily surveilled probation period where they tracked how the delivery person worked for 15 days, whether they committed fraud, how much time they spent around payments, how they handled money, and so on. So, and he visibly looked uncomfortable as he stated this, and kind of, implying that he wished he didn't have to come up with such a large number because he understood what it meant to each kind of delivery person that was on the platform. And when I look at use cases like this, I think about what these companies are doing in trying to design for the informal worker, right? Or people who have been, embedded in informal economy and systems. So the question of who governs what in terms of how data is shared is I think quite secondary to me. But who is really responsible for creating these metrics that are key to how the digital economy is going to run is really where I think we need to start thinking, deliberating about what that kind of justice means. So do you get justice for someone's labor through a state-sponsored credit system or a private one? Is it that the platform this platform has a more humane way of making a calculation than other platforms? And I wonder if the consultative, process of a public document would render a more humane outcome. It would most definitely, offer public oversight and agency of workers collectives. But this kind of political economy is particular to India and the countries of the global south. And I think this translation of Indian society or our socioeconomic demographics into computational languages is really key for me to peg questions of data justice. And I think just to give a small example of that before I kind of wrap up is even for me to try and understand what migration has meant to the platform economy, or just a simple question of who the gig worker is. There've been really obviously no secondary data sets to rely on and been kind of reliant on qualitative data and ethnography to try and suss those characteristics out and how they're translating into these technological systems. And one kind of use case I thought was really interesting, and I want to speak through very basically, very quickly, is how Uber and Ola drivers in Bangalore, where I do research, often join the platform because they're waiting for the rain to come, they're waiting for the monsoons to come, because their primary occupation is agriculture and farming. And Karnataka is a state that lacks institutional irrigation. It's a state that hasn't been able to provide employment for its citizens in smaller towns or villages. And given that Bangalore is the primate urban center of the city, of the state, there's a lot of migration for employment into the city. But what differentiates the platform is actually the fact of being able to be a data subject and being slightly more anonymous than people who would have found jobs otherwise, right? So in the informal economy, when someone has to find a job, you rely on networks, you rely on social trust, you rely on these kind of embedded relationships, which if you're moving in and out of the city very fast, you burn. And I think about what it means for these kind of insights to actually try and find some policy backing, right? So for me, this work was done through a small ethnographic sample of about 150 people, but the only kind of way I had of understanding whether this is true is through anecdotal stories from other people, or sitting in a closed door meeting with the policy heads of Uber, who then showed us these elaborate diagrams of movement within, one financial quarter of where people are coming from within the state of Karnataka into Bangalore and out. So I think the potential to try and understand where we peg the question of ownership and protection and security of data into these kinds of justice is really important for me. And I'm going to kind of pause there and come back to some other points later.
Yeah, thank you for that context. It was really helpful to also understand, what some of these lived experiences look like and the informal sector in India. And I think the idea of data justice that you kept coming back to is really interesting. And Gargi, I'd also love to hear more of your perspective on that. And if you could share some of your work that you've been doing, understanding humanitarian data partnerships and maybe how we can extrapolate some of these principles for thinking about data sharing for vulnerable communities in India.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be in community with you today. My name is Gargi Sharma. I was trained as a sociologist and a lawyer in India, and now I live in the Netherlands and practice human rights law in different ways. I'm a junior researcher at the Tilburg University, where I work on an ERC-funded project on global data justice, and I'm just going to jump right in. The concept of global data justice for us really stands on three pillars. First is visibility, invisibility, and hypervisibility that data lends to a human being in the digital world. Second is our ability to engage and disengage with technology. And the third is the discrimination and anti-discrimination that results from it. We know that digital data has both political and practical implications on how one is seen and treated. Like, the treatment could take the form of social good, or it could take the form of manipulation, puppeteering, and profiting. And that is why we're here today, to talk about how the concept of data stewardship can balance public good and individual rights. In the program, in the team, we look at data beyond merely a technological issue. We see it as a social justice one. And I think that because of the fact that I've spent a majority of my life in India and have studied all of these concepts there, my idea of social justice is very inspired by Indian social justice movements and law. So last year in October, I joined the Global Data Justice team to work on a project on humanitarian data partnerships. That is basically when humanitarian organizations and tech companies, they partner to provide aid in crisis situations. The humanitarian sector is basically, in a way, searching for a way to make aid efficient. And tech is seen as this flashy solution, like a silver bullet to everything that's wrong. Which is evident in how, the UN repeatedly talks about big data, and there's an increasing number of such humanitarian data partnerships, a lot of which don't have much publicly available information. And we wanted to know what was happening there, because basically datafying migrants' lives who are already very vulnerable. So we organized a series of expert meetings in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Kenya to talk to folks who work in the private sector, in the humanitarian sector, in academia, and from civil society organizations. And a few questions kept arising. First was regulation by law and self-regulation. The second was about data ethics and humanitarian ethics, and particularly do no harm or do no digital harm. And lastly, on accountability. My personal favorite is accountability. So I've worked with the government, with NGOs in the philanthropic sector. And one thing I've learned is that there's no common definition. We don't know what accountability means. Is accountability group discussions with beneficiaries? Is it grant reports that we write to our donors? Is accountability publishing numbers on our websites? Or specifically in the Indian context, is accountability providing information when you get an RTI application? On top of that, when we're studying about humanitarian crises, these are cross-border, cross-cultural issues. And accountability is a rather loaded term. It means something very specific in the English language when you're in the development sector. But when it's translated into different languages, it doesn't account for all of the complexity that comes with the term. So for example, when I translate the word accountability into the languages that I speak, Hindi, Punjabi, and Dutch, the word that comes out is roughly means providing answers. But that's not what we mean by accountability in the sector. How can we then talk about accountability in multicultural settings, in multi-language settings, at the UN level with 6 official languages and so many more that folks come in with, when we're trying to make international pacts and guidelines and principles and everything? We don't know what the term means. In trying to figure out what this actually means for our literature review, I came across a wonderful paper from 2015. I'm going to put it in the chat later, where the authors basically interviewed folks from different humanitarian and development organizations, trying to ask them what accountability means for them, and there was no one answer. 2 things that stood out to me was, is accountability responsibility, or is accountability a way of taking on liability or taking on the onus of doing something good? One thing we do know is that there's no relationship of trust without accountability, right? And especially with the level of innovation that's involved today, and especially when it comes to data stewardship, and particularly data trusts and data cooperatives, we don't have past examples of migration data during a pandemic. And so there is need for trust in our digital lives. And another issue that we consider is that, how does our accountability flow? From what I've seen is that accountability generally flows upwards, so in the form of grant reports that we write to our donors, or it flows outwards in terms of what we put on our website. So it's a beautiful website, flashy graphics. These are the numbers we're working on. But we don't really see accountability as it flows downwards, so to speak, which is basically towards beneficiaries or who are data actors. And here's where the concept of data stewardship comes in. And I believe that it's a useful tool in the current crisis. The biggest benefit of having data stewardship during the situation presently is that it requires respecting everyone's inherent equality, self-determination, and their inalienable rights to life and liberty. Please note that I did not include the term privacy here, because the issue is larger than privacy, right? Our choice to center individual and collective self-determination is what is key to ensuring justice, fairness, and equity in trying to not only address the current crisis that we face, but similar things that we have been facing and we will inevitably face if we do not address these questions head on and we do not translate our theory of justice into practice. And before I close, I would just like to give you 3 key takeaways from our understanding of the concept in the global data justice team. The first, data is a social justice issue, right? Data in the digital age, data determines how a person is treated and it exacerbates existing inequalities. So it's unwise to only look at it from a technological point of view or to prepare a tech solution and then try to insert ethics into it later. Second, just because something is non-binding does not mean that it's ineffective or useless. And especially in this sector and at the pace at which we need to act, non-binding but self-regulation as a collective, such efforts can be useful. And lastly, trust and accountability are key to addressing this issue, and they go hand in hand, which requires of us 3 things. First, who is the data actor and what are their demands? Second, how to engage the beneficiaries or the migrants in the decision-making process. And lastly, to ensure transparency. And with this, I'd like to close my opening remarks, and I look forward to delving deeper into the agenda with Aditi and Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, Gargi. That is, really helpful. I think also, especially questions around public accountability and building a bottom-up data steward, and what that looks like in our imagination. I think we'll unpack some of those questions later on in our panel. But I think now, Katie, we'd love to hear from you about about what data ownership means for those left out of the property rights system and your imagination of data stewardship in the context of open land data, and how some of those principles can be applied to thinking about migrant data movement.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me, and it's an interesting panel to be on for sure. So first of all, just want to give you guys a little bit of background on Cadasta Foundation. We were founded in 2015 as a nonprofit that develops and promotes the use of simple digital tools and technology to help partners efficiently document, analyze, store, and share critical land and resource rights information. Data stewardship is at the heart of our work at Cadasta, as we are data stewards for our more than 60 partners around the world. Cadasta was created to fill the land data gap of failed top-down land administration systems. And we use innovative technology, services, and advocacy to advance global land and resource rights, working with the world's tenure and secure people in rural, urban, and peri-urban environments. Recognizing that every partner is unique, our tools and services accommodates a wide range of technical capabilities and resources to various sectors. We have over 2.85 million people on our platform in 32 countries, representing over 1,500 communities. And some of our partners include CSOs and local communities, national and international NGOs, and more. Many of our projects are focused on working with partners in India. We have 17 current projects that have documented more than 1.3 million people. Our partners in India are advocating for property rights and informal settlements through improvement of data collection, management, and reporting processes, receiving formal government land certifications and certificates in urban informal settlements in indigenous areas, and securing formal claims under the FRA, the Forest Rights Act. 2 partnership examples I'd like to bring up are Tata Trust and Pradhan. In the Indian state of Orissa, government officials made international history and headlines with the Odisha Livable Habitat Mission, which utilized Cadasta's tools to identify, map, and issue formal land certificates to residents of urban informal settlements. And using drone imagery, community data collectors, and Cadasta's technology, it demonstrated the potential of bottom-up data collection and resulted in the issuance of over 70,000 official certificates of occupancy. By 2020, an estimated 1 million people will have been documented by the program, enabling these residents to invest in their properties and businesses without fear of eviction. Cadasta worked with Tata Trust by providing tools and training for over 800 community data collectors that were able to document over 160,000 households. The second example was in 2019, Pradhan, IFAD, and Cadasta successfully implemented a community and individual forest rights acquisition project for over 7,000 households in Jharkhand and Orissa states. Innovative solutions included the use of a fully integrated geographic information system for offline participatory mapping of community forest rights and individual forest rights, including in-person training of Pradhan by the Cadasta Foundation on participatory data collection techniques and methodology. The initiative's technical solution provided for monitoring and evaluation to address land disputes and ad hoc challenges. Both of these initiatives were with full community, CSO, and government participation and adhered to FPIC regulations. Cadasta ensures that all of our partners are trained on ethical GIS and data collection with specific modules that address these important aspects. Importantly, we ensure that all our partners' surveys, which we review prior to their field work, include informed consent. And since the onslaught of COVID, Cadasta has realigned with our partners' work to respond to the crisis in India by working with 3 partners to conduct household level surveys capturing not only food security and medical center locations, but also housing and migration information. One partner has currently digitized 500 households data, which has been captured by hand due to the complex nature of the COVID pandemic, in order to best provide food and medical supplies across multiple states. Over this particular partner has encountered a barrier to getting in touch with migrants stuck in cities. And as a note, these migrants' families have been the main source of data on these migrants stuck in the cities. This crisis response project has also identified that the majority of the migrant workers they surveyed were working in construction at approximately 86%. Perhaps not surprising to many of you, but 98% of those surveyed stated that once they returned to their villages, they were not planning on going back to the city anytime soon. A second example is in a homelessness-related household survey with more than 1,000 households surveyed in major cities and informal settlements across the country. And 9% of these respondents reported that they expected help from the government in sending migrant workers back to their hometowns during the pandemic. Now, lastly, as an example, according to another partner's data collection activity, which had over 7,000 surveyed across 10 states in all rural areas across India, when asked what was the participants' perception of the government's attitude towards migrant workers, more than 28% replied very good, and 9% replied very bad. And I'll just end a little bit here, where when we're talking about the imagination of stewardship for open land data, there's so many questions that abound. How do we ensure that living data is being protected? Who are the real stewards of the data? Who's maintaining the data? What do we do to account for the temporality of the data collected? Does an organization have the capacity to return to the communities for monitoring and evaluation? And data ownership is paramount for marginalized communities that are left out of the formal systems. access to smartphones, ability to access phone credit, and even technical capacity of users are questions our partners and our organization constantly have to assess for program implementation. Our partners are steadfast in their approaches to ensure data ownership and interaction with the communities they serve while recognizing that they live in a low-tech environment with perhaps low-tech capacity. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. I think, as you rightly highlighted, there is a need to kind of frame this conversation around basic service delivery mechanisms and how data sharing architectures can better align to enable that. Aditi, I think it would be interesting to come back to the point that you brought up earlier about responsibility and kind of your imagination of the role civil society should play in collecting, sharing access of data, and also what that might look like, what a data steward might look like in that context.
Yeah. I think, so just to kind of start again with an example of COVID, because one of the platform service providers unions in India, who I was in conversation with back in April when the lockdown was quite strict and quite new to all of us. And not only that union, but a few others that we work with at IIHS, that one of their main concerns and one of their main issues was not being able to contact any of the members as they started walking or leaving, maybe not walking back. And it seemed like a perfect moment for that, that data intermediary to step in and kind of synthesize the data between, say, platform companies who would have had access to location data of their service providers. But of course, that's a scenario where perhaps too early in the world right now. But I think having talked through some of those, some of the issues that union was facing, it kind of struck me how little they kind of understood the nature and kind of data that these companies held and had repositories of. And in having those conversations, it seemed to me that one, of course, there's this an exercise of civil society having to build their own capacity to understand how the economy is kind of moving, but also in how someone who, or an actor or an agency who becomes an intermediary, what kind of role they would have in the explainability, the comparability, and the usability of data that is either being sourced from between public agencies or private technology companies, right? And this is really one of the key kind of issues, even when we think about how to make platform work more decent, is whether service providers themselves are aware of the, say, algorithmic systems that they work under. But equally, if you think about just the kind of data that is sitting there on them, I would think that whether the kind of more bottom-up approach to understanding this would be to say have civil society, of course, be part of that, but also have a set of experts, a set of intermediaries who were able to make that data more usable to civil society itself, I think would be really important. And there's several parts of the data that platform companies have explain the scenarios that people actually face. So, the big thing in the platform economy is that a service provider signs a contract by clicking on the terms and agreements that come in a downloaded app. And for certain legal measures, this stands as a contract. For other legal measures, it doesn't stand as that. But the kind of lived experience of that work is that platforms and the digital labor market is segmented for many different kinds of workers. And it's strategized to be segmented for different kinds of workers. So even that kind of, those data points on what kind of contracts exist won't necessarily explain or make usable that data for people who are trying to find some kind of a justice approach. So, yeah. I think those three factors of explainability, comparability, usability are something that needs to kind of become part of the responsibility of someone who's holding and using that data, especially in a context like ours where literacy and justice are very kind of diverse. My ending remarks, I think Aditi has frozen. Ash.
Sorry, am I back online?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry, I might have missed that last part, but I think, yeah, those are interesting points. And I think I'm also curious to understand, Gargi, from your perspective, how these principles of usability and comparability, how you've seen them manifest in global examples of data sharing for migration or humanitarian crises, and, you know, how, you know, the positives and negatives of some of these principles.
Thank you. Unfortunately, from my understanding of things, the humanitarian sector isn't as forward in terms of kinds of data that can be used. There's a lot of new technologies that keep coming around. So there's biometrics and there's a bunch of stuff with identification and mapping people's movements, but there's no good example of data stewardship that I could find in this instance. I think that also has to come with this idea of, I'm a bit afraid to say it, but humanitarian supremacy, in the sense that providers of aid know what they're doing. And also this idea that, well, doing something is better than doing nothing. And so I think because of those two ideas, it becomes so much easier to look at issues of consent or issues of data sharing in a very different manner. Again, in the humanitarian sector, if you look at the recent ICRC handbook on data protection, the section on consent mentions that, you know, it's okay to, it requires consent, but it also concedes that it won't always be possible to get that consent. Someone might be sick or injured or unconscious. They cannot provide consent. Someone might not have any other option but to get that. So they cannot provide consent in that manner. And so where you talk about issues like usability and controllability, I think it's very important to also see what was the genesis of that data. And I think in the humanitarian sector, at least how I see, these are important considerations, but they're not the primary considerations. The primary considerations still stand to be public interest or legitimate interest, the service provider or the aid provider. I'm not entirely sure that answers your question, but I don't have anything else to add.
No, that's helpful. I think it would also be, you know, important to understand, Katie, from your perspective, how some of these mechanisms work at Cadasta and the role that you envision for a data steward, and how these principles play out in the role of stewardship at Cadasta.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you. And Aditi and Gargi, I'm like very much thinking about everything that you guys are saying too, and I'm curious to continue this conversation even offline. Yeah, so Cadasta takes our data stewardship very seriously. We provide the training for the sustainability of the organization that we partner with. So they're the ones that are supposed to do the data collection. They're the ones that are supposed to do any data cleaning or analysis. You know, we'll help them, you know, with analysis or, you know, some products at the end if they need that. But we won't even edit their own data. Like that to me, like that is as us, as our data stewards, that we have this platform in which all of these communities' data exist on. We won't even do that. We'll teach them how to edit their own data. So even from that perspective of even that, like maybe that might seem like a very minute detail, but I find that to be one of the most important aspects of like our data stewardship is that we won't even touch their data. That's theirs to touch. And you know, we don't necessarily we don't share the data. We have very strict data privacy agreements with every single partner. We don't share the data. We obviously have to report upwards, as Gargi said before, to our donors, but we aggregate that into a very specific way. And so we don't share the data at all unless there is a very set agreement between one organization and the other, and there would have to be a complete agreement signed and everything for that data to be shared with them. And so I hope that answers a bit of your questions, and I was reading some of the other questions here in the chat too, trying to get to that as well.
Yeah, that's helpful to understand some of the mechanisms. Are there specific principles you think from what you've seen that we should extrapolate for data stewardship for vulnerable populations based on your work at Cadasta? Is there anything that you would, from a broader theoretical perspective, that you would want to highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Definitely free informed consent, like FPEC, like absolutely 100% should be implemented across all projects. And also because we fully function within a bottom-up approach, it's really that we see the partners that we choose to partner with and to create these projects with and to work with. It's important for us that we see that they're including women even inside the data collection with their surveyors that they're using on the ground, that they're having entire sensitization projects, and really having these community discussions to where they understand what's going on. It's not just some random person from Cadasta Foundation showing up at a person's door. A lot of times these are community members, people they know. And so that's also, it's trust. It's about trust and responsibility that you're building over time. And that's what our partners do. And that's what we support.
Sounds great. I think I'm also hearing a lot of a discussion about the idea of consent. And I think we're curious about the idea of how community or collective fits in this context, especially in regards to consent, but also rights and bargaining power. And how do we envision a space in which, workers or laborers can exercise those rights from the community perspective. Aditi, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this from your work. Yeah.
Sure, I think, of course, to answer a very straight answer to your question is, of course, to have unions that are, that have the ability to kind of push their agendas and deliver change. But and that's a formal organized kind of community, right? And I think that while that's extremely important and that is something like we should definitely be working towards, I think in India, if you look at how the political economy of informality and how things work, there are many different kinds of communities that actually become really important in delivering some kind of agency or power, right? So if you look at domestic workers, they have a very small geographical radius of influence where, say, in one particular building or in an apartment building, they have maybe, they've restricted any other workers from coming in, they've built up their agency, and they have, a certain kind of bargaining power they've been able to kind of create. And that's kind of the way workers who don't have unions or who don't have formally recognized work tend to find ways of finding some power and agency, right? It isn't just that because you don't exist in a union, you're completely without agency or power. And if I start to think about what the digital economy or the fact of digital technology can actually offer to different kinds of collectives and communities, kind of picking up on the kind of work that Katie was talking about, is to think about, say, even in the construction sector, high-skilled workers tend to come from similar geographical areas. To think about that kind of community or collective being able to have some kind of agency without having geographical proximity to who they're bargaining with is extremely interesting to think about. You know, if they were to self-register, to create their own kind of understanding of what skilling means, to say being able to work with contractors or cut contractors out, and then kind of use that kind of community-based databasing and outreach to work towards interacting with whether they're, you know, technology players who are getting into the construction sector like a House Joy, or, you know, large real estate firms like Prestige who already exist in this with this infrastructure, could be a really exciting way to think about what that means in terms of who's creating the data, who's owning it, and how it's being used. And you know, I think personally, I found some of these ideas quite outlandish, considering, you know, where we kind of were pre-COVID. But since COVID has been one of the biggest forces of, and will be, of digitization and digitalization, I think we can start to think a bit bigger and start to mobilize some money and support around these things. So I think, yeah, actually using those migratory patterns to see what communities need agency could be a really interesting way of trying to turn this question around.
Yeah, that's a really helpful imagination, and I think important context for where a steward could come in. And I think Gargi also threw this question in your direction. We talked a little bit about kind of building these similar types of community or corridor-to-corridor access for data sharing mechanisms. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how you envision this, what this looks like. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, two primary things. I think one very useful model of data stewardship for the Indian context is a data cooperative, because it increases the collective bargaining power of the people, right? It centers beneficiaries' rights because they are the ones who are making the decisions in community, exercising their own self-determination. And it also, in my opinion, reinforces the idea that, yes, they're the ones who are receiving support, but it is their data, so it is about their rights. But at the same time, considering how India is and how things function there, I think a parallel process of engaging in conversation with local civil society organizations and bureaucracy to create a community of practice together, to try to envision what such a data sharing model would actually look like. I think that is very important for two reasons. One, for ensuring legitimacy of what is happening. And secondly, to also ensure success. So the fact that you're involving the state adds a layer of legitimacy to the action, because one, it's a state, and second, because the state's bound to respect your fundamental rights. And it also creates an accountability mechanism for the state. And secondly, because there is a broader engagement in the creation of such a model, I see that as increasing the chances of its success. But all in all, I think that the idea of using data stewardship to address the current crisis requires a radical reimagination of what we think relationship with data is, and not only what we can do for such models, but what can such models do for us. Thank you.
That is really helpful. I think we have about 30 minutes left, so I will take some questions that have been posted in the Q&A chat. Hamza asks, even though a large portion of migrants who have returned have expressed a desire to stay back, the simple truth of the matter is that there are towns and villages that cannot support them. And most of our social security infrastructure is not prepared to deal with such to and fro migration. How can data stewardship be leveraged to make social security more portable? And Aditi, maybe we can start with you on this one.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Hamza. You're right, absolutely, that people have had to come back quite fast because a lot of our country depends on cash-based kind of transactions and subsistence. Actually, I think the problem with migration not the problem with migration, but rather who takes accountability for the migrant worker, whether it's the home state or the receiving state, is a very large political question that we have battled with for, since we became a democracy. And, the idea of responsibility then also adds on to, in the context of these kind of provisions, is, how much is someone being able to contribute to the city or to the state that they deserve a certain kind of social protection. And I think so around those questions, there could be some forms of data that could be used to try and build those profiles up. But I'm unsure whether the political question of who's willing to take that responsibility will actually be answered just from presenting the data, because these are trends that we're well aware of, even tacitly, even though they tend to continuously go under the radar. And so I'm just gonna stop at that.
Great. We have a question from Ameya. For Aditi and Gargi. Are we making an assumption that visibility is a good thing? And do we have any sense domestically or internationally whether migrants themselves want to be visible to the state? Whoever feels comfortable answering that question. Two of you.
I can go first. I'd say both yes and no. And one of the things that we need to consider to answer that is the concept of hypervisibility and how data and state systems simultaneously make certain populations invisible and hypervisible. So when we look at economic and forced migrants coming to Europe, of course, there's a need to be visible to the state, to have the legitimacy to stay within a jurisdiction, to have proper documents to be able to live there and work and go to school and other things. But at the same time, the way certain structures the way certain systems are structured when it comes to forced migrants in the Netherlands, there is a value to not being hypervisible, in that in my work with forced migrants here, it's apparent that the country wants to present itself as a welcoming state, but at the same time, in doing so, it others the migrant. So I would not like to make an assumption either way that visibility is a good thing or not, but what I would like to say, and going back to Aditi's opening comments, it depends on who is creating these metrics and what is the value of those metrics. Those metrics going to be used, for example, in the Dutch Surie system, which predicts tax fraud, and one of the categories that's used in there can be a person's migration background. And so where will such data be used is very important in how visibility is added to a migrant's life. Thank you.
Aditi, did you have any other?
Yeah, I actually have a really curious example just to speak through. Colleagues of mine at IIHS work on the construction sector in particular, and labor around that, and kind of migration around that. And one of the main conversations that they were having with the Construction Real Estate Development Agency, which is the association, which is an association of many real estate builders, is that suddenly companies that have forcibly kept their workers invisible, kept say the lowest rungs of their workers invisible, and have used contractors and subcontracted labor value chains to make sure they have no responsibility towards their labor. When COVID happened, they realized that when migrant construction labor left the cities, so did the contractors, and they lost all kind of touch and association with anyone who could do any construction work. And construction work was one of the things that was allowed during the lockdown in a very limited fashion. It was a really interesting moment to see. We've had decades and decades of agencies and civil society asking these real estate companies to register their workers because their workers are eligible for benefits from the state, from the Construction Workers Board, except they continuously refuse to. So even who wants them to be visible at what time and whether that actual worker has the agency to do so is again out of really the question. But I would agree with what Gargi was saying, just to wrap up, that it's again it works on so many different levels. So it depends when that data is being used and who it's being created by.
Katie, I think this would be an interesting question for you to answer as well, and from your perspective, how visibility can help or harm vulnerable populations.
Yeah, so it's both. I think that I agree that it's both. It's not necessarily one or the other. There's curious cases of situations. Let's take, for instance, maybe informal settlements that government or government agency has decided to evict, bulldoze, however they're going to perform that eviction. Now, in some cases, there's been a positive effect of publicizing what's going on, meaning a positive effect of it stopping and ceasing the eviction. But then on the other hand, you have other situations where then that marginalized population and community is being adversely targeted due to their visibility. Like we say, we want to put people on the map, we want to put people on the map. We want to put people and their land and properties on the map. That doesn't mean that they don't exist already, just despite them not having formal data about them, though we live in this digital data forward world. That doesn't mean that their informal livelihoods, like Aditi was talking about, in the informal economy, that doesn't mean just because you exist within the informal economy, you don't exist within the economy of India. So I think that it can be positive and it can be negative to be present. And you have to be really careful about how you publicize any of this information.
Thank you. Gargi, we have a question for you. Could you, this is from Anonymous, could you say more about data cooperatives in India that puts ownership back into the hands of migrants and potentially other vulnerable groups? There would be the need to communicate the importance of data in the same way, and awareness and capacity around financial literacy. Would this be the responsibility of the public, private, or social sector, or a combination of any of these?
Thank you, Anonymous. This is a very good question. First, I would like to mention that data is basically anything known to be a fact or assumed to be a fact. So it's not that this is a new phenomenon. We're just talking about digital data right now as it relates to the pandemic. having your ration card is also data, or having your MG Narega card is also data. Sorry, the booklet is also data. When I talk about the idea of cooperatives is primarily because I'm a bit sick and tired of speaking down to people who are, seen as vulnerable. And I do not respect the idea that, college educated people coming from big cities, living overseas, are the ones who are the best judges of the situation. We can understand what digital data is, we can understand what digital exhaust is, but we're not the ones living with the consequences. And so what gives me the right to decide what's the best thing to do? All I can present is the information. This is what happens, this is how the data goes from one place to the other. For a person that, you could be tracked. One example I discussed with the Institute earlier was, you could still have non-personally identifiable data about movement, about eating habits, about size of groups moving. And that in itself would be able to tell us so much about the demographics of the group that's moving. And so it's not really, it is a responsibility of all of us as part of the community to talk about these issues. But at the same time, it is not my final decision, or anyone who's similarly placed to me whose final decision it is what to do. The vulnerability does not arise from the fact that a person exists as such. The vulnerability arises from the fact that they exist in a system that is such. And so I think the idea of data cooperatives more than data trusts appeals to me because it puts that idea of self-determination back to the data actor or to the beneficiary, instead of well-meaning but often misguided folks who tend to occupy such positions. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it'd also be helpful to get your perspective on where the responsibility lies in the context of cooperatives, and whether, which parties should be involved.
I think it's a very big state responsibility to be able to address this issue, primarily because we are a welfare state, and also because these issues that are within fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy in India. So instead of trying to come up with new regulatory mechanisms, I think it's best to first rely on what we already have enshrined in the Constitution. So I think state responsibility is important because that is also the best accountability mechanism we have. But that also means that we need checks and balances from the civil society. That also means that we need inputs from academics who study these issues for a living. What I would not be largely in favor of is giving the private sector free rein to do whatever, not because big data is bad, they are, but also because their first mission anywhere has to be profiteering and market making. Again, not because they're bad, while they are, but because that is their mandate. You can't be a registered company if you're not making profit. You can't be a social justice private tech company. That's not a thing. So I think the first responsibility is with the state. The second responsibility of trying to create such a mechanism is with, or trying to start to discuss such a mechanism will be with the civil society and academics, who will keep checks and balances on both the state and the private sector.
Thank you, that's helpful. I think this leads us well into our next question from Sushan, which is a question for all panelists. Should data stewardship be an independent function enabled through public investment, expert stewards, or should each initiative or institution embed data stewarding mechanisms as a core function with appropriate expertise, investment, and accountability? Katie, maybe we can start with you on this question, if you have any thoughts.
From an organizational perspective, I'd say that it should be an initiative of the institution that's embedded directly into it, which is very much a core function of Cadasta. But at the same time, if you want full accountability, should not a community also have their own stewards? Should they not have their own people that are there to speak for their interests?
Aditi or Gargi, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just actually, just pull together actually what Gargi said and Katie just said, that, you know, we're looking at how the state is behaving, whether the state is willing to do its responsibility. The state can still be called up to do its responsibility to hold, to deliver our fundamental rights. But, you know, if I look at the way the platform economy, especially with these gig economy platforms, has taken shape, I think what COVID has done has been to actually bring the state and platform companies even closer. And so you're seeing, you know, partnerships with state governments, specific districts that are looking to use the capacity of platforms either for their digital infrastructure or for their kind of reach out to consumers, or just for their kind of delivery personnel infrastructure for different purposes, right, and across the country. And it's also been a time in which platform companies have just kind of have been allowed to exist, while, you know, people who have been doing grocery delivery for centuries in small kirana stores have just not, and who supply neighborhoods who are walkable distances and all these other things. So I think just to bring back Katie's point, that the community is definitely, you know, a place where we have to have some hope and some, and really, I think, try and focus some of our, where public investment should actually go and trying to explain what these kind of matters mean, because we are seeing the, you know, the relationships become even closer, and I wonder how much more difficult that will make it to have these kind of neutral intermediaries, or what kind of power they'll be able to have.
Gargi, did you have any responses to this question?
I agree with both of the speakers, especially the idea that the intermediary has to be there in a way of not as a middleman profiteer, but more as a checks and balance data steward. Also because, you know, even if there is a data cooperative, you will still have one person who's been tasked with the job of representing what the collective wants. And yeah, I think reading the question again, I think there is room for expert stewardship. I think there's room for expert stewardship, just like there's room for an ombudsman at the central or state level. But at the same time, because I believe in multiplicity of checks and balances, I think civil society organizations, just as yourself, and I know the Cadasta Foundation is interested in looking into the issues. I think that is a very important role that we play as social actors. Thank you.
I would like to add one thing, just in what the speakers were saying. So it's interesting that a question came into my mind. Obviously, there are tons of nonprofits, there's CSOs, and we want to assume that they have altruistic intentions. Now, as within communities and societies, you can elect officials, you can elect representatives, you're placing trust in groups of people to be your stewards. But who are the ones that are holding the nonprofits and the CSOs, sometimes the CEOs, accountable? Just a question.
Yeah, the question of accountability and also public accountability, I think, is one that keeps coming up, and definitely a big one in the context of stewardship. One last question from Anonymous again. Community-based intermediaries and stewards are often political in their partnerships. And for migrants, how do we think about data and sharing in this context when it is deeply embedded in partnerships? Aditi, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I do, but I think I kind of misheard the question. But so it's looking at what responsibility means in terms of migrants.
It's community-based intermediaries or stewards are often political in nature, and what does that mean for in terms of using CSOs that may have this leaning or partnership?
Sure. I think just kind of reading into how the question's written and maybe reading between the lines, we inherently tend to think that political is bad, or political has an aim, or it has an intention that possibly isn't neutral. And I think when it comes to data, it is inherently political in that we've just listened to the way that Gargi's been kind of explaining the fundamental concepts behind what data justice means, or even just the examples that Katie's been taking about how putting someone on the map and making them, you know, from a data object to a data principle, possibly, is an inherently political act, because it's, you know, forcing them into different kinds of processes that they probably didn't anticipate or don't know too much about. So I wouldn't be, you know, I wouldn't be too concerned with the fact that community-based organizations have politics behind them. I think for anyone to try and form agency and form a voice around certain matters, you do need to have some political bent or some political mindedness. Now, I don't mean this to mean that, you know, any kind of political party can come take over an agenda, but I think inherently a collective or a community has some kind of common political agency, which I think is something to hold on to. But I do think that when it comes to, you know, the formulation of what a data steward is, or say the group that comes around to do that, it could be, and I think that is where, even in that formation, is where, you know, you would have checks and balances that would hopefully negate some of, you know, some of the issues with, say, parties taking over versus people being able to speak.
I'll wrap up by asking a question of my own, and kind of, you know, we've heard a lot about the importance of community and bottom-up data sharing, and I'm curious from your perspective what happens now in terms of the crisis, as Aditi mentioned earlier, in the state of emergency. What do mechanisms like data sharing, how can and should they look? And if we were to design a data steward for vulnerable communities, especially with these bottom-up considerations in mind, what does that look like in the near-term future? Katie or Gargi, if you have any thoughts on this as well.
All right, I'll go. I think it would be smart to start with what we already know. And we know things like steel workers unions. One question that was mentioned was construction workers unions. We know about domestic workers unions, if those unions don't exist. domestic workers have agency unions, and those are places where there is already collective bargaining going on. So you don't need to start a new collective. You already have a united voice coming. And as Aditi mentioned earlier, it is necessarily political, and it has to be, because it is a political demand being asked in a political moment based on lack of action or inaction outright. And so I think it's important to start with what we already know. One thing that I'm sure of is that it's not sustainable, it's not culturally appropriate, it's not acceptable if there's no community input. What does that community input mean? That people who are part of such a data stewardship, trust, collective model have the ability to file complaint against their steward, right? Not only the final user or processor of data against the steward, they have the ability to make suggestions. They have the ability to report misconduct, and they have the ability to do this anonymously. And even more important, or equally important, is the fact that we need to understand, I think Katie mentioned it earlier, 29% of folks said it was amazing. 8% people about the same thing said it was awful. And so I think it's also important to understand what is the cultural idea of aid and what is the cultural idea of receiving help, because the parts of India that I know, just the fact that you're receiving something means you have to be grateful, means that you don't want to file a complaint, which means you're even hesitant to make a suggestion. So two immediate things that we need to do is that try to start with what we know, and also make room for possibilities that people can have their input. And this doesn't necessarily have to be a 10-point questionnaire. This could easily be a group discussion at a tea shop, talking about, oh yeah, this thing's happening, what do you think about it? Do you think it could be better or worse? Meeting folks where they are without talking down to them is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Katie, did you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, those are all great points, 100%. And thinking about it within the context of a continuing crisis, in response mode, even still, maybe not even mitigation at this point, if you're going to speak from it from an emergency management perspective. It's absolutely necessary to understand the systems that exist, but also the data that exist in order to inform the decisions. You've seen that across the world, that people are using all these various data sets. And a lot of times in emergency situations and crises, you need to have appropriate partnerships in order to share data across the public and private platforms. But someone asked in our partners' research, did they find how many migrants? Is there knowledge? Is there an understanding of how many migrants have returned to their villages? The answer is still no, not yet. And I think until we really understand that, there's a lot of unanswered questions for decision making that will have to be answered. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is about all of the time that we have today. We have heard some really interesting points about centering the conversation of building data sharing architectures around the community and from a bottom-up perspective, and especially, you know, the importance of straying away from broader political agendas that are motivated by techno-solutionism. So thank you to all the panelists for joining me today and spending the time to discuss this topic. I hope this will only be the first of many conversations